They boarded a luxury cruise ship as newlyweds, glowing with love and plans for the future. 5 days after their wedding, they vanished. No screams, no witnesses, no bodies. Just a perfectly made bed and a silver bracelet engraved with a wedding date, left behind in an empty cabin drifting through the Caribbean night. What happened to Charles and Evelyn Morrison is a mystery so disturbing, even seasoned investigators admitted the ocean didn't just hide the truth, it erased it. Before we dive into every haunting detail of this disappearance, I need you to do something for me right now. If you're fascinated by unsolved mysteries, if you can't stop thinking about cases like this, if you believe that every missing person deserves to have their story told, then hit that subscribe button. We're building a community here at Cold Case Crimson of people who refuse to let these stories fade into obscurity. Ring that notification bell because we're covering cases that the world needs to remember, cases that deserve answers, and I don't want you to miss a single episode. Now let's get into what happened aboard the MS Caribbean Dream. The heat that afternoon was suffocating. It was August 12th, 1995, and Fort Lauderdale, Florida was experiencing the kind of oppressive summer weather that makes tourists question their vacation choices the moment they step off an air-conditioned plane. At Port Everglades, one of the busiest cruise terminals in the world, hundreds of passengers were making their way up the steep gangway of the MS Caribbean Dream, a massive luxury liner that promised 10 days of tropical paradise sailing through the Western Caribbean. The air hung thick and heavy, saturated with the competing scents of diesel fuel from the ship's idling engines, coconut-scented sunscreen being applied liberally by pale vacationers who knew they were about to spend days in the brutal Caribbean sun, and that distinctive smell of ocean salt that always seems to cling to harbors and docks. Among the crowd of excited tourists hauling oversized suitcases and wearing brand-new straw hats purchased specifically for this trip were Charles and Evelyn Morrison. Both were 31 years old. Both were radiating that unmistakable glow that newlyweds seem to carry with them wherever they go. They had been married for exactly 5 days. Their wedding ceremony had taken place on August 7th at Riverside Chapel in Knoxville, Tennessee, an intimate candlelit evening affair that 70 close friends and family members had attended. According to everyone who was there, it had been beautiful, romantic, and filled with genuine joy. The couple had written their own vows, personal promises that had left barely a dry eye in the chapel. Evelyn had cried tears of happiness throughout the ceremony. Charles had kept glancing at his bride as though he couldn't quite believe his extraordinary luck in finding her. This Caribbean cruise was a generous wedding gift from Charles's older sister, Margaret, who worked as a travel agent specializing in honeymoon and anniversary trips. She had insisted that her little brother and his new bride deserved something truly unforgettable, something that would create memories to last them their entire lives together. Margaret had personally selected the MS Caribbean Dream because of its stellar reputation for excellent service, romantic atmosphere, and attention to detail. She had used her industry connections to upgrade their cabin at no extra cost. She had arranged for champagne and chocolate-covered strawberries to be waiting in their room when they boarded. She had done everything within her power to ensure that their honeymoon would be absolutely perfect, a trip they would talk about for decades to come. Margaret Morrison would spend the rest of her life tormented by the wish that she had chosen a different ship, a different cruise line, a different gift entirely. Charles Morrison was the type of person who kept his spice rack alphabetized and his tools arranged by size in his garage. He worked as a civil engineer for the Knoxville Department of Public Works, where over 6 years of employment, he had earned a solid reputation for being meticulous, reliable, thorough, and perhaps slightly obsessive about details and procedures. His colleagues affectionately joked that Charles probably had backup plans for his backup plans, and they weren't exaggerating by much. When he packed for the cruise, he had created a detailed checklist on his computer, printing it out and checking off each item as it went into the suitcases. He had labeled every piece of luggage with laminated tags that included not just his name and home address, but also his passport number, his sister Margaret's contact information, and the details of their travel insurance policy. He carried a sealed, waterproof envelope containing photocopies of every important document they might possibly need: their passports, their cruise tickets, their marriage certificate, their travel insurance policy, a list of emergency phone numbers, and even contact information for the American embassies in every single country they would be visiting during the cruise. Everything had its proper place in Charles Morrison's carefully organized world. Everything followed a system. Everything could be anticipated, prepared for, and controlled. Evelyn Morrison was his opposite in many ways, though they complemented each other beautifully. Where Charles was structured, cautious, and methodical, Evelyn was spontaneous, warm, and openly affectionate. She taught third grade at Sequoia Elementary School in Knoxville, where she was absolutely beloved by students, parents, and fellow teachers alike. Children who had been lucky enough to have Mrs. Morrison as their teacher would remember her decades later as the teacher who really listened when you talked, who learned every single student's name on the very first day of school, who brought her acoustic guitar to class on Friday afternoons and taught them folk songs and silly rhymes. She had a personal collection of vintage postcards that she had been carefully curating since her college years, picking up unique cards from antique shops, flea markets, and estate sales wherever she traveled. Her charming ritual was to write a message to her future self on each postcard describing what she had seen, what she had experienced, and how the trip had made her feel, then mail it to her home address. She loved the delightful surprise of receiving these messages from her past self weeks, or even months later, little time capsules of joy and wonder that would arrive in her mailbox long after the trip had ended and regular life had resumed. On her left wrist, Evelyn wore a custom-made sterling silver bracelet that Charles had given her as a wedding gift during their rehearsal dinner. It was engraved with their wedding date in delicate flowing script, 08.07.95. When he had fastened it around her wrist that night, she had promised him with tears in her eyes that she would never take it off, that she would wear it every single day for the rest of their lives together as a symbol of their love and commitment. In her shoulder bag, she carried a small leather-bound journal with unlined cream-colored pages where she documented her thoughts, sketched things that caught her artistic eye, and compiled running lists of everything that made her happy. The journal had been a thoughtful gift from her maid of honor, and Evelyn had already filled more than 40 pages with observations about wedding planning, honeymoon anticipation, and her hopes and dreams for the future she and Charles would build together. The Morrisons were assigned to Cabin 318A, located on the port side of Deck 3 toward the middle of the ship. It was not one of the luxury suites with private balconies, ocean views, and separate living areas that occupied the higher decks. It was a modest interior stateroom, the type of cabin that budget-conscious travelers typically book when they plan to spend the majority of their time exploring the ship, attending activities, and visiting exotic ports rather than lounging in their room. The cabin had no windows or portholes, which made it dark and slightly claustrophobic. 2 standard twin beds had been pushed together by housekeeping to create the appearance of a double bed, though the gap between the mattresses remained visible and uncomfortable. A narrow closet provided just enough space for about a week's worth of vacation clothing on hangers. The bathroom was tiny, with a shower stall so compact that you had to be genuinely careful not to bang your elbows against the walls when you washed your hair. But none of these minor inconveniences mattered at all to Charles and Evelyn Morrison. They were deeply in love. They were on their honeymoon. They were about to spend 10 glorious days in tropical paradise together. At precisely 6:15 in the evening on August 12th, the MS Caribbean Dream's massive horn blasted twice, a deep resonant sound that announced their departure to everyone within a mile radius of the harbor. The enormous ship, weighing more than 70,000 tons and stretching over 800 feet from bow to stern, began its slow and deliberate separation from the dock. Excited passengers lined the railings on every deck, waving enthusiastically to people on shore who had come to see them off, taking photographs to commemorate the moment, soaking in that magical feeling of anticipation that comes when a real adventure is about to begin. The ship's 4 powerful diesel engines hummed steadily to life, creating a vibration that could be felt throughout the vessel, and the massive liner turned south toward open water, leaving the Florida coastline and all of its problems and routines behind. By nightfall, the glittering lights of Fort Lauderdale had faded to nothing more than a faint glow on the distant horizon. The MS Caribbean Dream was cutting smoothly through calm Caribbean waters under a sky absolutely packed with brilliant stars, the kind of spectacular celestial display that people who live in cities with light pollution almost never get the chance to see. The tropical air was warm and soft against the skin. The ocean was remarkably smooth and peaceful. Everything seemed absolutely perfect, exactly what everyone on board had been hoping for and dreaming about. Over the first 3 days of the voyage, Charles and Evelyn Morrison were highly visible throughout the ship. They were social, friendly, and active, exactly what you would expect from a young couple celebrating their honeymoon. Crew members and fellow passengers would later provide detailed accounts to investigators of their movements and behavior during those first 72 hours, painting a picture of a perfectly normal vacation right up until the moment it became anything but normal. On the first evening, August 12th, they attended the welcome aboard party on the Lido deck, a massive outdoor gathering where the cruise director enthusiastically introduced the entertainment staff, explained the ship's daily schedule and activities, encouraged everyone to let loose and have fun, and reminded passengers about safety procedures and emergency protocols. The Morrisons were photographed by the ship's official photographer standing near the main pool, both of them holding colorful tropical drinks garnished with paper umbrellas and fresh pineapple wedges. In the photograph, which would later be examined frame by FBI agents looking for any possible sign of distress or fear, they appear completely relaxed and genuinely happy. Evelyn is laughing at something happening off camera. Charles has his arm wrapped protectively around her waist, and he's smiling that easy, comfortable smile of a man who has everything he could possibly want. On August 13th, the ship spent the entire day at sea as it made its way south toward Cozumel, Mexico, the first scheduled port of call. Evelyn was spotted in the Horizon Cafe during breakfast by multiple witnesses, including a retired couple from Cincinnati, Ohio, who struck up a friendly conversation with her while waiting in line at the buffet. She told them enthusiastically about how much she loved working with young children, how she was already looking forward to getting back to her classroom when school started in late August, how she and Charles were hoping to start a family of their own in perhaps a year or two once they had managed to save enough money for a down payment on a house in a good school district. She was drinking iced tea with lemon and writing in her leather journal, periodically looking up from her pages to gaze out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the endless expanse of turquoise ocean. Charles joined her at the table about 20 minutes into breakfast, apologizing sheepishly for sleeping late and admitting that he had forgotten to set an alarm. He ordered black coffee and a toasted bagel with cream cheese. The couple from Cincinnati remembered thinking what a genuinely nice young couple they were, how obviously and deeply in love they appeared to be, how you could just tell by watching them interact that they were going to have a wonderful life together, filled with happiness and children and love. That same afternoon, Charles and Evelyn attended a poolside party where a reggae band brought in from Jamaica played enthusiastic covers of Bob Marley songs and other Caribbean classics. Several different passengers would later recall seeing them dancing together near the pool, though multiple witnesses noted with amusement that neither of them seemed particularly skilled or coordinated. They were awkward and self-conscious, laughing at their own lack of rhythm and natural ability, occasionally bumping into other dancers or stepping on each other's feet. But they were genuinely trying their best, and they were obviously having fun. And that's really what mattered. One witness, a woman from Atlanta, Georgia, who was celebrating her 40th birthday on the cruise with a group of girlfriends, specifically remembered Evelyn Morrison because she had approached her to compliment her sundress and ask where she had purchased it. They ended up chatting for nearly 10 minutes about shopping, travel destinations, and what it was like to be an elementary school teacher in the modern age. The woman from Atlanta would later tell FBI investigators that Evelyn had seemed absolutely lovely, bubbly, and genuine and sweet. Definitely not someone who seemed troubled or fearful, or like she was hiding some terrible secret. On August 14th, the MS Caribbean Dream docked in Cozumel, Mexico for its first port of call. This was the moment that many passengers had been eagerly anticipating, the chance to finally get off the ship and explore an exotic foreign destination. The vast majority of passengers disembarked for various shore excursions, organized tours that had been booked either before the cruise or through the ship's excursion desk. The Morrisons had booked a snorkeling tour through the cruise line, a 4-hour excursion that included round-trip transportation from the pier to a beautiful coral reef, all necessary equipment provided at no extra charge, and an experienced bilingual guide who would help nervous beginners feel comfortable and safe in the water. The tour was operated by a local Mexican company called Caribbean Adventures that worked exclusively with the cruise line and had an excellent safety record. According to their meticulous records, which were later examined by both Mexican authorities and American investigators, Charles and Evelyn Morrison were confirmed to have been on that particular tour. They checked in at the meeting point on the pier at 9:30 in the morning. They were issued Coast Guard-approved life jackets, diving fins in their appropriate sizes, and snorkeling masks that the guide helped them adjust properly. They boarded a 30-foot boat along with 18 other passengers from the MS Caribbean Dream, and the group motored out to a reef about 20 minutes from shore. The snorkeling guide that day was a man named Javier Reyes, a 34-year-old Cozumel native who had been leading these exact tours for 6 years and had taken out literally thousands of tourists during that time. Javier would later tell Mexican police and then American FBI investigators that he remembered the Morrison couple very clearly and distinctly. They had stayed together the entire time they were in the water, swimming side by side at all times, pointing out colorful fish and coral formations to each other with obvious excitement, holding hands whenever they weren't actively swimming and needed both arms for balance. Evelyn had been noticeably nervous at first, uncomfortable and slightly panicked by the strange sensation of breathing through a snorkel while her face was submerged in salt water. But Charles had been extraordinarily patient, and encouraging with her, staying right beside her, holding her hand, talking her through her anxiety until she began to relax and trust the equipment. By the end of the 2-hour tour, she was having an absolutely wonderful time, diving down to get closer looks at interesting fish, laughing through her snorkel when a curious sea turtle swam past. When they finally returned to shore and removed all their equipment, Javier specifically remembered seeing Evelyn take out her leather journal and quickly sketch the sea turtle she had been so excited about seeing. She showed the sketch to Charles with obvious pride, and he had smiled warmly and kissed her gently on the forehead, a tender moment that Javier found touching. They returned to the MS Caribbean Dream by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The ship departed Cozumel right on schedule at 4, once all passengers and crew members had been accounted for through the mandatory ID card scanning system. That evening, Charles and Evelyn had dinner at one of the ship's more casual dining venues, the Sunset Grill, which served American comfort food like burgers, sandwiches, hot dogs, and fresh salads. They chose to sit at a table on the outdoor section of the restaurant, positioned right along the railing with an unobstructed view of the ocean. Their waiter that evening was a young man named Paulo Delgado, originally from Ecuador, who had been working on cruise ships for 3 years. Paulo remembered the Morrison couple specifically because Evelyn had done something that most passengers never bothered to do. She had asked him personal questions about his life, genuinely wanting to know where he was from, what his hometown was like, how long he had been working on cruise ships, whether he enjoyed the work, whether he missed his family. She was truly interested in his answers, not just making polite conversation while waiting for food. She listened intently to everything he said, asked thoughtful follow-up questions, and treated him like a real human being rather than an invisible servant whose only purpose was to bring food and refill drinks. Paulo would later tell investigators that this kind of treatment was genuinely unusual. The vast majority of cruise passengers treated service staff as essentially invisible, barely making eye contact, rarely saying thank you, certainly never asking about their lives or showing any interest in them as people. But Evelyn Morrison had been different. She had been kind, warm, and genuinely caring. He had appreciated that kindness deeply, and that's exactly why he remembered her so clearly when investigators came asking questions. After their casual dinner, Charles and Evelyn attended a comedy show in the ship's main theater, a beautiful venue decorated in red and gold with plush seating for approximately 600 guests. The comedian that night was a middle-aged man from New York City who specialized in clean, observational humor about relationships, travel mishaps, and the general absurdities of modern life. The show was very well attended, with approximately 400 passengers filling the comfortable theater seats. No one who was interviewed later reported seeing anything unusual or concerning during the show. No one specifically remembered Charles or Evelyn Morrison from that particular performance, but that actually makes perfect sense when you think about it. They were just two people sitting in the darkness among hundreds of other passengers, laughing at jokes, enjoying a show. There was no reason for anyone to pay special attention to them or remember them specifically. On August 15th, the fourth full day of the cruise, the MS Caribbean Dream was once again at sea, making its way toward Grand Cayman, the next scheduled port of call. This was what cruise lines call a sea day, a full day for passengers to relax on board, enjoy all the ship's amenities and activities, attend various entertainment options, or simply lounge by the pool with a good book and a cold drink. The MS Caribbean Dream offered literally dozens of different options for how to spend a sea day. Bingo games in the card room, napkin folding demonstrations in the dining room, ballroom dance lessons on the Lido deck, fitness classes in the gym, wine-tasting seminars, art auctions featuring supposedly valuable paintings and sculptures, trivia contests, cooking demonstrations by the ship's executive chef, and much more. Charles and Evelyn Morrison were seen multiple times throughout the day by various crew members and passengers. They ate breakfast at the Horizon Cafe buffet, loading their plates with fresh fruit, scrambled eggs, bacon, and pastries. They spent about half an hour in the casino, trying their luck at the slot machines and losing approximately $20 before deciding that gambling wasn't really their thing and giving up. They attended an elaborate ice carving demonstration on the Lido deck, where one of the ship's talented chefs carved an incredibly detailed swan out of a massive 300-pound block of ice using special chisels and tools, a performance that drew a large and appreciative crowd. They were photographed yet again by the ship's official photographer, this time posing in slightly more formal attire, in front of a painted backdrop, depicting a gorgeous Caribbean sunset. In the photograph, Evelyn wore a navy blue dress that came to just above her knees. Charles wore pressed khaki pants and a crisp white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. They looked happy, relaxed, and perfectly normal. There was absolutely no indication whatsoever that this would be the very last photograph ever taken of them alive. That evening was when everything changed forever, though nobody realized it at the time. Charles and Evelyn Morrison had made a reservation for 7:30 at the Compass Rose dining room, the ship's most upscale and elegant restaurant located on Deck 5 toward the stern. The Compass Rose featured crisp white tablecloths, sparkling crystal glassware, multiple-course meals prepared by classically trained chefs, and a strictly enforced dress code that required men to wear collared shirts and dress pants, while women were expected to wear dresses, skirts, or very nice slacks. It was the kind of restaurant that felt special and sophisticated and romantic. Exactly the sort of place where honeymooners would want to have a memorable dinner. The maitre d' on duty that evening was a man named André Bouchard, a distinguished-looking French-Canadian gentleman in his early 50s who had worked on various cruise ships for 14 years and had developed a reputation for excellent customer service and attention to detail. He remembered the Morrison couple very specifically because Evelyn had made a special request when they arrived for their 7:30 reservation. She had asked very politely if it would be possible for them to be seated at a table near the windows rather than in the center of the dining room. She explained sweetly that she absolutely loved watching the moonlight reflecting off the water, that it was one of her very favorite things about being on a ship at night. André had been happy to accommodate her request, seating them at table 42, an intimate two-person table positioned directly against the floor-to-ceiling windows that lined the entire starboard side of the restaurant and offered spectacular views of the dark ocean. Evelyn had also taken a moment to comment enthusiastically on the beautiful orchid centerpiece that decorated their table, asking André if the flowers were real or artificial. He had confirmed with obvious pride that yes, absolutely all the flowers throughout the Compass Rose were genuine fresh-cut flowers, replaced every 3 days without fail to ensure they always looked perfect. She had smiled warmly and said that was absolutely wonderful, that she really appreciated when establishments paid careful attention to those kinds of small but important details. Their waiter that evening was a young man from the Philippines named Rico de Leon, 26 years old, who had been working on the MS Caribbean Dream for 8 months, diligently saving every dollar he could to send money home to his family in Manila. Rico would later provide FBI investigators with a remarkably detailed account of the Morrisons' dinner that evening, creating one of the most complete and reliable records of their final known hours that investigators would have to work with. The couple ordered drinks first, as was customary in the formal dining room. Evelyn requested a glass of white wine, specifically a Pinot Grigio from California. Charles ordered a beer, choosing a local Caribbean lager that the ship stocked from one of their regular port stops in the islands. For appetizers, they decided to share a shrimp cocktail. 6 large prawns served on ice with cocktail sauce and fresh lemon wedges. For their main course, they both ordered the grilled mahi-mahi with roasted seasonal vegetables and creamy garlic mashed potatoes, one of the chef's specialties that evening. Rico noted that they ate slowly and leisurely, talking quietly to each other in the intimate way that couples do, occasionally pausing to look out the window at the dark expanse of ocean and the brilliant stars overhead. Rico checked on them 3 separate times during their meal, as he had been trained to do, and each time they assured him warmly that everything was absolutely delicious, that the food was excellent, that they didn't need anything else, that they were perfectly content. For dessert, they made the decision to share a single generous slice of key lime pie, one of the restaurant's signature desserts. Rico brought the plate with 2 forks. He watched as Evelyn took the very first bite, closed her eyes in obvious pleasure, and declared enthusiastically that it was quite possibly the best key lime pie she had ever tasted in her entire life. Charles laughed affectionately and teased her gently, saying that she said that exact same thing about literally every key lime pie she ever tried. She playfully argued back that no, this time she absolutely really meant it. This particular pie was genuinely exceptional. They were smiling at each other. They were gently teasing and flirting in that comfortable way that happy couples do. They were behaving exactly like newlyweds, celebrating their honeymoon should behave. Rico brought them their final check at $9.25. They paid in cash, leaving behind a generous 20% tip that Rico genuinely appreciated. They thanked him sincerely for his excellent service throughout the meal. Evelyn complimented the food one final time, making a point to tell Rico that he should pass along her compliments to the chef. And then they stood up from table 42. Charles held out his hand to help Evelyn with her chair, and they walked together out of the Compass Rose dining room and disappeared into the night. That was the very last confirmed sighting of Charles and Evelyn Morrison by anyone who would later come forward to investigators with information. According to the ship's electronic keycard system, which automatically logged every single time a cabin door was opened or closed anywhere on the vessel, someone used a keycard to enter cabin 318A at 10:47 that night. The computer system couldn't identify which of the 2 key cards issued to the Morrisons had been used, as the system only recorded that a valid card for that specific cabin had been scanned. But it did record the exact time with digital precision, 10:47 and 33 seconds, to be absolutely exact. After that single entry, there was nothing. No further activity, no keycard scans, no record of anyone entering or leaving cabin 318A. The ship's printed itinerary for August 16th indicated an arrival in Georgetown, Grand Cayman, at 8 o'clock in the morning. The MS Caribbean Dream was scheduled to remain docked at the pier until 6 in the evening, giving passengers a full 10 hours to explore the island, go shopping along the famous 7-Mile beach, visit the Cayman Turtle Farm, take glass-bottom boat tours, or enjoy any number of other activities and excursions. The cruise line had arranged literally dozens of different shore excursions for passengers to choose from, ranging from submarine rides to stingray encounters to rum distillery tours to visits to beautiful botanical gardens. Charles and Evelyn Morrison had not pre-booked any organized excursions for their time in Grand Cayman. According to records from a questionnaire that all passengers filled out during the embarkation process on the first day, They had indicated a preference for exploring ports independently rather than joining organized group tours. This was not particularly unusual or suspicious. Many experienced travelers and younger couples preferred the freedom and flexibility of wandering around on their own, finding interesting local restaurants that weren't filled with tourists, browsing small shops, discovering hidden gems and authentic experiences that weren't part of the standard tourist circuit. At 9:30 on the morning of August 16th, cabin steward Hector Villanueva knocked firmly on the door of cabin 318A, ready to begin his daily housekeeping duties. Hector was 34 years old, originally from Honduras, and he had been working for this particular cruise line for 6 years, steadily working his way up from an entry-level laundry position to the more prestigious role of cabin steward. His job was to service all cabins on Deck 3, which meant cleaning bathrooms until they sparkled, making beds with perfect hospital corners, restocking towels and toiletries, vacuuming carpets, and generally making sure that passengers' rooms were tidy, comfortable, and welcoming when they returned from their daily activities. He typically serviced each cabin on his assignment list between 9 and 11 in the morning, the window of time when most passengers were either at breakfast or had already gone ashore to explore the port. When Hector knocked loudly on 318A, there was no answer from inside. This was completely normal and expected. The vast majority of passengers didn't stay in their cabins during the daytime hours. He knocked again, even louder this time, and announced himself clearly in accented English. "Housekeeping. May I come in, please?" Still no response from inside the cabin. He pulled out his master key card from the holder on his belt, the special card that could open any passenger cabin door on the ship, and used it to unlock the door. He pushed it open and stepped inside. What he found immediately struck him as strange and wrong. The beds were still perfectly made. Not just made, but absolutely perfectly made, exactly as he himself had left them the previous morning during his routine cleaning. The sheets were pulled tight without a single wrinkle. The pillows were arranged symmetrically with military precision. The decorative throw pillows were in their exact proper positions. It looked exactly like a hotel room in a glossy magazine advertisement, completely untouched and pristine and sterile. Both suitcases were still sitting open on the luggage rack at the foot of the beds, with clothing neatly folded inside exactly as they had been for days. Hector could clearly see pants, shirts, swimsuits, sundresses, underwear, all organized as though the Morrisons had been living directly out of their suitcases rather than unpacking their belongings into the closet and drawers provided. This wasn't particularly unusual in itself. Plenty of passengers never fully unpacked during a cruise, preferring to just pull out what they needed each day and leave everything else in their luggage. On the small nightstand positioned between the two twin beds, Hector noticed Charles Morrison's waterproof envelope containing backup documents, still sealed with its contents intact, sitting in exactly the same spot where it had been since the first day. He noticed it specifically because he had seen it during every single cleaning over the past several days and had been quietly impressed by such thorough preparation and organization. In the small bathroom, on the narrow shelf beside the sink, lay Evelyn's silver bracelet, the one engraved with their wedding date that she had promised never to remove. It was coiled in a perfect, neat circle, as though she had very carefully removed it and deliberately set it down rather than just dropping it carelessly or letting it fall. Hector stepped further into the cabin and looked around more carefully, his sense that something was wrong growing stronger. There was no sign whatsoever of any struggle or violence. Nothing appeared broken, damaged, or out of place. No drawers were hanging open. No items were scattered carelessly on the floor. The small safe in the closet was closed, but appeared to be unlocked. The television was off. The curtain that separated the small sleeping area from the tiny entryway was pulled all the way open. It simply looked like a cabin where two people had stepped out for the day and would be returning shortly. But something felt deeply wrong to Hector, something he couldn't quite articulate or explain. In his 6 years of working on cruise ships, he had cleaned literally thousands of cabins. He had seen every possible variation of mess and order, from rooms that looked like tornadoes had hit them to rooms kept obsessively neat. This was different. This felt off in a way he couldn't fully explain. The combination of the perfectly untouched bed, the organized suitcases, and especially that silver bracelet sitting beside the sink created an uneasy feeling deep in his gut, an instinctive sense that something bad had happened. Hector completed his cleaning duties quickly, replacing the towels with fresh ones and restocking the bathroom with small bottles of shampoo, conditioner, and lotion. But he kept thinking about the cabin and couldn't shake his growing concern. At 11:30, during his scheduled lunch break, he sought out his immediate supervisor, a stern but fair woman named Clara Mendoza, who oversaw all housekeeping operations on decks 3 and 4. He told her that the couple in cabin 318A hadn't slept in their bed last night, that all their belongings looked completely untouched, that there was a bracelet sitting on the bathroom counter, that something about the whole situation seemed strange and wrong to him. Clara asked him if he was absolutely certain that the bed hadn't been slept in. Sometimes guests were very neat and particular, making their own beds before leaving their cabins for the day. Hector insisted firmly that no, this absolutely wasn't a bed that had been made by passengers trying to tidy up. This was a bed that had not been disturbed at all, not even slightly, since he himself had made it with perfect hospital corners 24 hours earlier. He could tell the difference. He knew his own work. Clara made a note of Hector's concern in her daily log, but didn't consider it particularly urgent or alarming. Passengers did strange and unpredictable things on cruises all the time. Maybe the couple had stayed up all night drinking and gambling in the casino, and were now sleeping it off in a lounge chair somewhere on deck. Maybe they had met another fun couple at dinner and ended up partying in their cabin instead. Maybe they had gotten into a silly argument about something trivial, and one of them had decided to sleep somewhere else to cool off. It wasn't housekeeping's job or responsibility to track passenger behavior, only to keep cabins clean and well-maintained. But by 3 o'clock in the afternoon on August 16th, Clara Mendoza was starting to feel genuinely worried. She accessed the ship's computer system and checked the shore excursion logs to see if the Morrisons had signed up for or checked in to any tours in Grand Cayman. Their names didn't appear anywhere in the system. She then checked with the gangway monitors, the crew members stationed at the exits who scanned every passenger's ID card when people left the ship, and then scanned them again when they returned aboard. According to those electronic records, Charles and Evelyn Morrison had not disembarked in Grand Cayman. Their ID cards had not been scanned at all. Clara went back to cabin 318A herself to verify Hector's report. She knocked loudly several times. No answer. She used her own master key card and entered cautiously. Everything was exactly as Hector had described in precise detail. The beds completely untouched, the suitcases undisturbed, the sealed envelope on the nightstand, the silver bracelet beside the bathroom sink. But now it had been over 18 hours since the last confirmed sighting of the Morrison couple, and absolutely no one could account for their whereabouts or explain where they had gone. At 4:15 that afternoon, Clara reported the situation up the chain of command to her supervisor, who immediately contacted the ship's security office with growing alarm. Victor Langley, the head of security for the MS Caribbean Dream, was a former sergeant with the Royal Bahamas Police Force who had spent 12 years in law enforcement before transitioning to the private sector and maritime security work. He was 51 years old, highly experienced in investigations, and definitely not someone prone to panic or overreaction. He received the report from housekeeping at 4:30 and went immediately to cabin 318A to personally assess the situation and determine what was going on. Victor examined the cabin slowly and methodically, with the trained eye of someone who had investigated hundreds of crime scenes. He noted the perfectly made beds that clearly hadn't been slept in. He examined the organized suitcases with their neatly folded contents. He picked up the sealed envelope of backup documents and confirmed that it had never been opened. He studied the silver bracelet coiled beside the bathroom sink. He checked the small bathroom carefully for any signs of illness, injury, or distress. Nothing at all. He looked through the trash cans, which were empty because housekeeping had already cleaned the cabin and de-emptied them that morning. He checked the narrow closet and saw a few items of clothing hanging there. A sundress, 2 shirts, a pair of pants. Nothing unusual. He examined the safe in the closet, confirming it was unlocked and completely empty inside. Victor's primary concern at this point was whether the Morrisons had somehow fallen overboard, either by terrible accident or by some other means that he didn't want to think about too deeply. Falling overboard from a cruise ship was thankfully rare, but definitely not unheard of in the industry. According to statistics maintained by the Cruise Lines International Association, approximately 20 to 25 people went overboard from cruise ships each year worldwide. The vast majority of those incidents were suicides, unfortunately. Some were alcohol-related accidents where intoxicated passengers climbed on railings or lost their balance, and a very small number, the ones that haunted investigators and kept them awake at night, were the result of foul play. The enormous problem facing Victor was that if someone goes overboard at night in the middle of the ocean, the chances of ever finding them alive are virtually zero. The Caribbean Sea is vast beyond comprehension, covering approximately 1 million square miles. The water is deep, in many places thousands of feet deep. Bodies sink quickly in salt water, and if they do eventually surface days or weeks later due to gases from decomposition, they're often never recovered, carried away by powerful ocean currents, consumed by sharks and other marine life, or simply lost forever in the immense expanse of water. Victor pulled out his radio and immediately called for a comprehensive ship-wide search. He wanted every single public area checked thoroughly, every lounge, every bar, every restaurant, every bathroom, every deck, every corner where passengers might conceivably be. He wanted the medical center contacted to see if either Charles or Evelyn Morrison had sought any kind of treatment or medical attention for any reason whatsoever. He wanted the casino staff to review their records and surveillance footage. He wanted the spa to check their appointment books. He wanted the gym to see if anyone had signed in. He wanted every single crew member on duty to be asked directly if they had seen or interacted with the Morrisons at any point since the previous evening. By 7 o'clock that evening, after nearly 3 full hours of intensive searching and questioning, Victor had to accept a deeply disturbing and troubling reality that he didn't want to face. Charles and Evelyn Morrison were simply not on the ship. They had vanished completely. At 7:15, Victor contacted Captain Soren Lindqvist, the master of the MS Caribbean Dream, and informed him that they had 2 passengers who were unaccounted for and presumed missing. Captain Lindqvist, a stern Swedish officer with 30 years of maritime experience, immediately ordered a complete review of all available security footage, even though he already knew in his gut that the ship's surveillance system had massive blind spots that would probably make the footage useless. The MS Caribbean Dream's security camera network was woefully inadequate and outdated by even 1995 standards. The ship had been originally built in 1987, and while it had undergone various cosmetic renovations and mechanical updates over the 8 years since its launch, a comprehensive modern surveillance system had simply never been a priority for the cruise line's management or accountants. The cameras that did exist covered only the most essential areas, the main entrances and exits where passengers boarded and disembarked, the casino floor where cheating and theft were constant concerns, and the bridge where all navigation and ship operations took place. That was essentially the full extent of camera coverage. Large portions of the ship, including all cabin corridors, most outdoor decks, the vast majority of restaurants and bars, and nearly all recreational areas, had absolutely no camera coverage whatsoever. Deck 3, where cabin 318A was located, had exactly 0 cameras monitoring it. The outdoor decks, where someone could easily climb over a railing and fall, or be pushed into the ocean, were completely and totally unmonitored. Victor Langley and his small security team spent the entire night reviewing what little footage actually existed in the system. They found several images of Charles and Evelyn Morrison from earlier in the cruise, entering and exiting the casino on August 13th, boarding the ship on the very first day with their luggage, standing in line at the photo gallery to look at pictures from the welcome aboard party. But they found absolutely nothing from August 15th that showed where the couple had gone after their dinner at the Compass Rose, whom they might have interacted with, or what could possibly have happened to them. At 8 o'clock in the morning on August 17th, the MS Caribbean Dream docked right on schedule in Georgetown, Grand Cayman, though now under completely different and far more somber circumstances than anyone had anticipated. Captain Lindqvist immediately contacted the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service to report 2 missing American passengers. Within less than an hour, plainclothes detectives from the RCIPS boarded the ship and began their own independent investigation into the disappearance. Detective Inspector Michael Thompson, a 20-year veteran of the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service with extensive experience in criminal investigations, took personal charge of the case. He interviewed Victor Langley at length about everything the ship's security had done. He reviewed all the available security footage himself. He personally examined cabin 318A, photographing everything, taking detailed notes. And he began the massive and time-consuming process of interviewing passengers and crew members who might have any relevant information whatsoever. The enormous problem facing Detective Inspector Thompson was the sheer scale of potential witnesses. The ship was carrying approximately 1,200 passengers and roughly 600 crew members on this particular voyage. That meant 1,800 potential witnesses who might have seen something important, and the vast majority of them had absolutely no idea who Charles and Evelyn Morrison were, or whether they had encountered them at any point. The Morrisons were just 2 ordinary faces in a massive crowd of vacationers, not celebrities, not troublemakers, not people who naturally stood out or attracted attention in any particular way. Detective Inspector Thompson and his team worked with impressive speed and efficiency, focusing their initial efforts on passengers whose cabins were located near 318A, staff members who worked in dining rooms and public areas where the Morrisons were known to have spent time, and anyone who had signed up for the same shore excursions or activities. They conducted a telephone interview with Javier Reyes, the snorkeling tour guide from Cozumel. They spoke extensively with waiters, bartenders, photographers, entertainers, housekeeping staff, deckhands, engineers, maintenance workers. Everyone was cooperative and wanted to help, but absolutely no one had any information that could explain what had happened to this young couple. The weather records for the night of August 15th were pulled and carefully reviewed. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration confirmed through their data that conditions in that particular part of the Caribbean had been essentially perfect and ideal. Seas were remarkably calm, with swells measuring less than 3 feet. Winds were very light, averaging only about 8 knots, barely enough to ruffle your hair. Visibility was excellent, with clear skies and no fog or haze. The moon had been nearly full, providing significant natural light across the water. There had been absolutely no storms, no unusual weather events, nothing whatsoever that would cause a ship to rock violently or create any kind of dangerous conditions on the open decks. This important finding effectively ruled out the possibility that Charles and Evelyn had been swept overboard by a rogue wave or had lost their balance due to the ship pitching in rough seas. If they had gone into the water, and that seemed increasingly likely, it had to have been for some other reason entirely. Detective Inspector Thompson also carefully examined the ship's complete manifest and detailed passenger list, looking for anyone with any kind of criminal record or documented history of violence. The cruise line did maintain basic biographical information on passengers for security and liability purposes, though comprehensive background checks were not routinely performed on every single person who booked a cruise. Nothing in the records jumped out as immediately suspicious or concerning. This appeared to be a completely typical Caribbean cruise, full of families with young children, retired couples, and honeymooners looking for a relaxing, tropical vacation. At noon on August 17th, Detective Inspector Thompson held a serious meeting with Captain Lindqvist, Victor Langley, and several representatives from the cruise line's corporate headquarters who had flown to Grand Cayman on an emergency basis to manage the growing crisis. The consensus among everyone in that room was grim and unavoidable. Based on all the evidence available, or rather the complete and total lack of any evidence whatsoever, Charles and Evelyn Morrison had almost certainly gone overboard sometime after 10:47 on the night of August 15th. Whether they had jumped together in some kind of suicide pact, fallen accidentally, or been pushed by someone was completely impossible to determine based on what they knew. Captain Lindqvist contacted the United States Coast Guard, which has legal jurisdiction over American citizens who go missing in international waters. The Coast Guard immediately coordinated with the Bahamian Royal Defense Force and other Caribbean maritime authorities to organize a comprehensive search and rescue operation, though absolutely everyone involved understood, with sad certainty, that the odds of finding survivors at this point were infinitesimally small. It had now been well over 36 hours since the Morrisons were last confirmed to have been seen alive. Even if they had somehow miraculously survived going overboard, which was statistically extremely unlikely, they would have been floating in the open ocean for more than a day and a half, exposed to intense sun and dehydration during the day, possible hypothermia at night despite the warm water, and the very real danger of sharks and other predatory marine life. Search and rescue aircraft from multiple countries flew careful grid patterns over the area where the ship had been sailing on the night of August 15th, with observers scanning the water through binoculars for any sign of bodies, debris, life jackets, or anything else that might be related to the missing couple. Coast Guard cutters searched the same general area methodically. They found absolutely nothing. Not a life jacket, not a single piece of clothing, not a body, not even a floating shoe. The ocean appeared to have swallowed Charles and Evelyn Morrison completely, without leaving behind a single trace of their existence. On August 18th, the cruise line's senior management made the difficult decision to cancel the remaining scheduled ports of call in Montego Bay, Jamaica, and Roatan, Honduras, and return directly to Fort Lauderdale as quickly as possible. The mood aboard the MS Caribbean Dream had shifted dramatically and completely from vacation mode to something much darker and more fearful. Passengers were frightened, confused, and increasingly angry. Many felt very strongly that the cruise line hadn't done nearly enough to protect them, that security measures were woefully inadequate, that the lack of cameras was inexcusable, that they deserved real answers and explanations. Other passengers were simply deeply sad and heartbroken for this young couple who had come aboard expecting the honeymoon of their dreams and instead disappeared without a trace into the night. The massive ship arrived back at Port Everglades in Fort Lauderdale on August 19th, 3 full days earlier than originally scheduled. Waiting at the dock were FBI agents, local police officers, representatives from the cruise line's corporate security division, and a rapidly growing number of journalists and television crews who had caught wind of the story. Missing passengers on cruise ships were relatively rare and therefore automatically newsworthy, but a vanished honeymoon couple was the kind of tragic story that really captured widespread public attention and imagination. It was mysterious, romantic in a dark way, and deeply unsettling to anyone who had ever taken a cruise or was planning to. FBI Special Agent Laura Kaplan was officially assigned as the lead investigator on the case. She was 38 years old, based out of the FBI's busy Miami field office, and specialized specifically in maritime crimes and investigations. Over the next several weeks and months, she would conduct one of the most thorough and exhaustive investigations in cruise ship history, dedicating herself completely to trying to answer what seemed like a simple question. What happened to Charles and Evelyn Morrison? Agent Kaplan began her investigation by methodically re-interviewing everyone who had already spoken with Cayman Islands police, but this time with the full resources and forensic expertise of the Federal Bureau of Investigation behind her. She brought in specialized forensic technicians to examine cabin 318A literally inch by inch, looking for anything that previous investigators might have missed. They carefully dusted every single surface for fingerprints, including the walls, the door frame, the bathroom fixtures, the nightstand, even the television remote control. They used luminol, a chemical that reacts with blood and causes it to glow under ultraviolet light, to check for any blood that might have been present and then cleaned up. They examined the bathroom drain carefully for any hair samples, tissue samples, or other biological evidence. They checked the beds under magnification to see if there was any possible sign that they had been slept in and then carefully remade to hide that fact. They looked for defensive wounds on the walls, scratches on the doorframe, broken fingernails, anything whatsoever that might indicate a struggle had taken place. They found absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. The fingerprints found in the cabin belonged to Charles Morrison, Evelyn Morrison, and various housekeeping staff members who all had completely legitimate reasons to be there. There was no blood anywhere, not even microscopic traces. No signs whatsoever of violence or struggle. No indication that anything criminal or violent had occurred in that cabin. Agent Kaplan also conducted extensive interviews with Charles and Evelyn's families back in Tennessee, trying to understand if there were any hidden issues in their lives that might have led them to commit suicide together. She spoke at length with Charles's sister Margaret, who was absolutely devastated by overwhelming guilt and grief, tortured by the thought that her gift had somehow led to their deaths. Margaret insisted emphatically that her brother had been happier than she had ever seen him in his entire life, that he absolutely adored Evelyn, that they were actively planning their future together with excitement and hope. There was no history whatsoever of depression, no financial problems or debts, no dark secrets that might have driven them to such a desperate and final act. Evelyn's parents, Robert and Susan Gardner, told Agent Kaplan exactly the same story. Their beloved daughter had been absolutely thrilled about the wedding, genuinely excited about the honeymoon, looking forward with joy to starting her married life with Charles. She had actually called them from the ship on August 13th using the expensive ship-to-shore phone service, a brief call that cost nearly $15 just to tell them she was having the most wonderful time of her life. She had sounded genuinely happy and excited. She had been laughing and bubbling with enthusiasm. She had said the ship was absolutely beautiful, and the food was amazing, and Charles was spoiling her and treating her like a princess. There was absolutely nothing in that conversation that suggested anything was wrong, that she was unhappy, or that she was contemplating anything terrible. Agent Kaplan formally requested the Morrisons' complete medical records from their doctors in Knoxville. Charles had absolutely no history of mental illness, no prescription medications for depression or anxiety, no red flags whatsoever in his medical history. Evelyn had been briefly treated for mild anxiety during her college years, nothing serious or concerning, and hadn't seen a therapist or taken any medication in over 5 years. Neither of them had any history of substance abuse or addiction. Their bank accounts and credit card statements were thoroughly examined by FBI financial analysts. No unusual transactions, no large withdrawals that might suggest they were planning to disappear and start new lives somewhere. No significant debts or financial pressures that might have created unbearable stress. Their finances were modest but completely stable and healthy. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, and acquaintances were systematically interviewed. Everyone said essentially the same thing. Charles and Evelyn were kind, normal, well-adjusted people who were deeply and obviously in love. No one could possibly imagine either of them harming themselves or each other. It simply didn't make any sense. The FBI also investigated the possibility of foul play. Agent Kaplan and her investigative team looked carefully at every single other passenger and crew member on the MS Caribbean Dream, searching for anyone who might have any motive or opportunity to harm the Morrisons. They examined whether Charles or Evelyn had gotten into any arguments, altercations, or conflicts with anyone during the cruise. They looked for anyone who might have been following them, stalking them, or paying unusual or inappropriate attention to them. They checked for any known criminals or violent offenders among the passengers and crew. Once again, they found nothing useful. No one reported any conflicts or confrontations. No one had heard arguing, screaming, or sounds of a struggle. No one had seen the Morrisons in the company of anyone who made them uncomfortable or afraid. The ship's detailed casino records showed that they hadn't gambled enough to win or lose any significant amount of money that might have attracted the wrong kind of attention from criminals. They hadn't been flashing expensive jewelry or large amounts of cash. They hadn't been drinking excessively or using drugs. They hadn't done anything whatsoever that would make them obvious targets for robbery or violence. One theory that emerged and was seriously investigated was that someone had sexually assaulted Evelyn, and that either she had been killed during the assault or had jumped overboard afterward in despair, with Charles either trying to save her or following her in grief. But there was absolutely no evidence to support this theory. No one had reported seeing Evelyn in distress. No one had heard screams. No one had seen her with any injuries. The timeline didn't really work either, because both of them appeared to have disappeared at essentially the same time. Another theory was that they had been the victims of a random robbery gone wrong, that someone had followed them back to their cabin intending to rob them and things had escalated to violence. But again, there was no evidence. Nothing was missing from their cabin. Their cash, credit cards, and traveler's checks were all accounted for. Evelyn's jewelry, including a diamond engagement ring and pearl earrings, was sitting in plain sight in the cabin. If someone had killed them during a robbery, why wouldn't they have taken these valuable items? Agent Kaplan also investigated the ship's crew extensively, looking for anyone with a criminal history or pattern of predatory behavior. She discovered that the cruise line's background checks on crew members were shockingly inadequate. Many crew members came from developing countries where criminal records were difficult or impossible to verify. Some crew members had been hired with minimal vetting. But despite this concerning discovery, she couldn't find any specific crew member who appeared to have had any interaction with the Morrisons beyond normal service duties. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story and understands just how frustrating and heartbreaking this investigation became for everyone involved. As the weeks turned into months, Agent Kaplan had to confront the possibility that she might never know what happened to Charles and Evelyn Morrison. The case remained open, but active leads had essentially dried up. The Coast Guard had suspended their search after 5 days without finding any trace of the couple. The ocean had kept its secrets. But Agent Kaplan refused to give up entirely. She continued to investigate, to interview people, to look for new angles. She became something of an expert on cruise ship disappearances, studying similar cases going back decades, looking for patterns or connections that might shed light on what happened to the Morrisons. What she discovered was deeply troubling. Cruise ship disappearances were far more common than the general public realized. The cruise industry was very good at keeping these incidents quiet, at downplaying them, at settling with families privately to avoid publicity. Since cruise ships operated in international waters, they fell into a complex legal gray area where jurisdiction was unclear and investigations were often inadequate. Agent Kaplan found dozens of cases similar to the Morrisons. Young people who simply vanished from cruise ships without explanation. Bodies that were never found. Investigations that went nowhere because of inadequate security footage, lack of witnesses, and the simple fact that the ocean destroys evidence. She also discovered that some cruise lines had been deliberately misleading about their safety records. They would report disappearances as passengers who had simply disembarked at a port and failed to return, making it sound like the person had gotten lost on shore rather than admitting they had vanished from the ship itself. The more Agent Kaplan learned, the more frustrated and angry she became. She began advocating publicly for better safety measures on cruise ships, comprehensive camera coverage, better railing heights, mandatory man-overboard detection systems, stricter crew background checks, and clearer legal jurisdiction for investigating crimes at sea. In 2001, 6 years after the Morrison disappearance, Agent Kaplan was invited to testify before Congress about cruise ship safety. She brought with her a thick file of unsolved disappearance cases, including the Morrisons. She told the heartbreaking story of Charles and Evelyn's vanishing to a room full of senators and representatives. She showed them photographs from the couple's wedding, just 5 days before they boarded that ship. She explained how inadequate security measures had made it impossible to determine what happened. Her testimony helped lead to new regulations requiring cruise ships to have better security systems. though many advocates felt the new rules didn't go far enough. The cruise industry fought hard against more stringent requirements, arguing they were too expensive and unnecessary. Meanwhile, Charles and Evelyn's families struggled to move forward with their lives while having no answers, no closure, no bodies to bury. Margaret Morrison quit her job as a travel agent, unable to continue in an industry that had taken her brother from her. She started a small support group for families of people who had disappeared on cruises, providing emotional support and advocating for better investigations. Robert and Susan Gardner, Evelyn's parents, became advocates as well. They gave interviews to any journalist who would listen. They appeared on television news programs. They created a website dedicated to their daughter's memory and to raising awareness about cruise ship disappearances. They collected hundreds of postcards that Evelyn had mailed to herself over the years and compiled them into a small book that they privately published, a tribute to their daughter's love of life and travel. The missing persons case remained officially open. Every few years, there would be a new development that would briefly revive hope. Someone would report seeing a woman who looked like Evelyn in some distant location. A body would wash up on a Caribbean beach, and authorities would check to see if it might be one of the Morrisons. But every lead turned out to be a dead end. In 2005, 10 years after the disappearance, the state of Tennessee declared Charles and Evelyn Morrison legally dead, a necessary legal formality that allowed their families to settle their estates and access death benefits. The declaration felt wrong to everyone involved, like giving up, like admitting defeat. But it was necessary. Agent Kaplan retired from the FBI in 2012 after a long and distinguished career. The Morrison case remained one of her biggest regrets, one of the cases that haunted her, that she dreamed about at night. In her retirement, she continued to study the case privately, still hoping that somehow, someday, new evidence would emerge that would finally explain what happened on that August night in 1995. Theories about the Morrison disappearance proliferated over the years, especially on internet forums and true crime websites, where amateur detectives liked to analyze unsolved cases. Every possible scenario was discussed and debated endlessly. The murder theory suggested that someone on the ship, either another passenger or a crew member, had killed Charles and Evelyn and disposed of their bodies overboard. Proponents of this theory pointed to the fact that both of them disappeared simultaneously, suggesting they were attacked together or that one witnessed the murder of the other. They also noted that Evelyn's bracelet had been removed and left behind, possibly by someone who killed her. But skeptics argued there was no evidence of violence, no motive, and no suspects. The accident theory proposed that Charles and Evelyn had gone up on deck late at night to look at the stars, perhaps had a few drinks, and somehow both fell overboard. Maybe one fell and the other jumped in trying to save them. Maybe they were leaning over a railing, taking a selfie, or looking at something in the water, and both lost their balance. This theory had some plausibility, but it required a lot of coincidences and didn't explain why Evelyn's bracelet was in the cabin. The suicide pact theory suggested that Charles and Evelyn had jointly decided to end their lives by jumping overboard together. Proponents pointed to the fact that they disappeared together and that the cabin looked undisturbed, as if they had carefully prepared for their deaths. But this theory had serious problems. Everyone who knew them said they were happy and excited about their future. There was no note, no history of depression or mental illness, no financial problems, no motive whatsoever. Why would two people who had just gotten married and were on their dream honeymoon suddenly decide to kill themselves? The staged disappearance theory was popular among conspiracy-minded internet users who suggested that Charles and Evelyn had faked their deaths to escape some unknown problem in their lives, perhaps witness protection or massive debts or secret enemies. This theory was exciting but completely unsupported by any evidence. Their finances were stable. There were no signs they were in any kind of trouble, and most importantly, there had been absolutely no confirmed sightings of them anywhere in the world in the nearly 30 years since they vanished. The human trafficking theory suggested that Charles and Evelyn had been kidnapped from the ship and sold into slavery or forced labor. This theory was particularly popular after the movie Taken became a cultural phenomenon. But maritime security experts pointed out that kidnapping two people from a cruise ship and transporting them undetected would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible. The ship never docked anywhere during the relevant time period. There was no way to get them off the vessel without being seen by dozens of crew members. The most disturbing theory, and one that law enforcement actually took seriously for a while, was what became known as the crew cover-up theory. This theory suggested that someone on the ship's crew had killed Charles and Evelyn, possibly a crew member that Evelyn had rejected sexually, or a staff member involved in some kind of criminal activity that the Morrisons had accidentally witnessed. The theory further suggested that other crew members had helped cover it up to protect their colleague and avoid a scandal that would damage the cruise line's reputation. Some versions of this theory even suggested that the captain himself might have been involved in the cover-up. This theory gained traction after several former cruise ship employees came forward in the early 2000s with stories about how cruise lines routinely covered up crimes, intimidated witnesses, and protected crew members from prosecution. They described a culture of silence where employees who spoke out about misconduct were fired and blacklisted from the industry. They talked about crimes being deliberately misreported or not reported at all to avoid bad publicity. Agent Kaplan actually investigated this theory quite thoroughly. She interviewed dozens of crew members from the MS Caribbean Dream, many of them years after the incident, when they were no longer employed by the cruise line and had less reason to lie. She offered immunity from prosecution in exchange for information. She made it clear that she cared about finding the truth, not about protecting the cruise industry's reputation. But despite all her efforts, she found no evidence of a cover-up. The crew members she interviewed seemed genuinely shocked by the disappearance. Many of them had liked the Morrisons. Several crew members broke down crying during interviews, distressed by what had happened to the young couple. If there was a conspiracy of silence, it was either impossibly well maintained or it simply didn't exist. One small development in 2008 briefly revived interest in the case. A woman in Costa Rica contacted the FBI claiming that she had been a crew member on the Caribbean Dream in 1995 and had information about the Morrison disappearance that she had been too afraid to share at the time. Agent Kaplan, though retired by then, was contacted by the agent handling the call and immediately flew to Costa Rica to interview the woman personally. The woman, whose name was never publicly released, claimed that she had seen Charles and Evelyn arguing intensely on an outdoor deck late on the night of August 15th. She said Charles had been grabbing Evelyn's arm roughly and that Evelyn had been crying. The woman claimed she had walked past them quickly, not wanting to get involved in what appeared to be a domestic dispute. She said that when she heard the couple had disappeared, she had been afraid to come forward because she was in the country illegally and feared deportation. Agent Kaplan was initially excited by this potential breakthrough. She interviewed the woman extensively over 3 days, taking detailed notes, asking clarifying questions, trying to determine if the account was credible. But as the interview progressed, serious problems with the woman's story emerged. Her description of what Charles and Evelyn were wearing didn't match what other witnesses had reported. She claimed to have seen them on Deck 7, but that deck had been closed for maintenance that night, according to ship records. She couldn't remember basic details about the ship's layout or her own duties. When pressed, she eventually admitted that she might have the dates confused, that maybe it had been a different couple she had seen, that her memories from 13 years earlier weren't as clear as she had thought. Agent Kaplan came to believe that the woman either had false memories, was confused about what she had seen, or was deliberately lying in hopes of receiving some kind of reward money that she believed might be available. The lead went nowhere. In 2015, 20 years after the disappearance, several major television networks produced documentary specials about the Morrison case. The story had become legendary in true crime circles, one of those enduring mysteries that captured people's imaginations. The television shows interviewed family members, showed old photos and videos, brought in experts to discuss various theories, and generally rehashed all the known facts of the case without adding anything new. The documentaries did serve one useful purpose. They generated hundreds of new tips and leads that poured into the FBI tip line. Agents had to follow up on each one, even though the vast majority were obviously worthless. People reported seeing Evelyn Morrison working in a bakery in Vermont, living on a commune in New Mexico, teaching English in Thailand. None of the reports checked out. Margaret Morrison, Charles's sister, watched all the documentaries and cried through each one. She was in her 60s now, her hair gone gray, her face lined with decades of grief. In interviews, she said that not knowing what happened was worse than any definitive answer could be. At least if she knew they had died in an accident, she could mourn them properly and move on with her life. The not knowing meant the wound never healed. Every time her phone rang, a small part of her hoped it might be news that they had been found, that somehow they were still alive, that there had been some incredible misunderstanding. Robert and Susan Gardner, Evelyn's parents, both passed away in 2018 and 2020 respectively, never knowing what had happened to their daughter. At both of their funerals, Evelyn's chair at the service remained empty, a symbolic gesture recognizing that she was not there but would never be forgotten. They were buried together in Knoxville, and the headstone they had chosen included a third name, Evelyn Morrison, beloved daughter, beloved wife, lost at sea, August 1995. The MS Caribbean Dream continued operating for several years after the Morrison disappearance, though the incident had damaged its reputation. Bookings declined, particularly among honeymooners who understandably felt uneasy about choosing a ship where a couple had vanished. The cruise line tried various promotions and discounts to lure passengers back, but the ship was forever associated in the public mind with tragedy and mystery. In 2003, the ship was sold to a different cruise line and renamed the Ocean Majesty in an attempt to distance it from the negative publicity. It operated under that name for another 12 years before finally being sold for scrap in 2015. When the ship was dismantled, some people hoped that maybe something would be found hidden somewhere inside the vessel, some clue that had been missed during investigations, maybe even the bodies of Charles and Evelyn Morrison concealed in some impossible location. Nothing was found. The ship was reduced to scrap metal and recycled, and whatever secrets it might have held disappeared with it. Over the years, the Morrison case was frequently cited in discussions about cruise ship safety and maritime law. Advocates for reform used it as a prime example of why better regulations were desperately needed. They pointed out that if the ship had been properly equipped with comprehensive camera coverage, the mystery probably would have been solved within hours. If there had been sensors to detect when someone went overboard, rescue efforts could have been launched immediately, possibly saving lives. The cruise industry responded to mounting pressure by gradually improving safety measures. By 2010, most major cruise ships had significantly upgraded their security camera systems to cover more areas. By 2015, some ships had installed sophisticated thermal imaging systems that could detect people in the water even at night. By 2020, man-overboard detection systems using infrared sensors and artificial intelligence were becoming standard equipment on new vessels. But all these improvements came too late to help Charles and Evelyn Morrison. They had been on a ship that was woefully unprepared to prevent or investigate a disappearance. They had been failed by inadequate safety measures, ineffective security, and a cruise industry that had prioritized profit over passenger protection. As of today, in 2026, more than 30 years after Charles and Evelyn Morrison vanished from the MS Caribbean Dream, the case remains officially unsolved. It sits in an FBI file cabinet in Miami, one of hundreds of cold cases that agents hope might someday be cracked by new technology, new witnesses, or new evidence. The ocean that swallowed them has never given up their bodies. No wreckage has ever been found. No deathbed confessions have been made by crew members. No dramatic revelations have emerged. The mystery remains as impenetrable as it was on August 16, 1995, when cabin steward Hector Villanueva first knocked on the door of cabin 318A and found it empty. So what really happened to Charles and Evelyn Morrison? After examining all the evidence, all the theories, all the investigations, what is the most likely explanation? The truth is that we simply don't know, and we may never know. That's the frustrating reality of this case. But if we had to make an educated guess based on the available evidence and the expert opinions of maritime investigators, the most probable scenario is this. Charles and Evelyn Morrison went up on deck late on the evening of August 15th after returning to their cabin from dinner. Perhaps they wanted to see the stars. Perhaps they wanted to enjoy the warm night air. Perhaps they wanted a romantic moment alone before going to sleep. They went to one of the outdoor decks that had no camera coverage and no other passengers or crew members around. Something happened. Maybe one of them leaned too far over the railing and lost their balance. Maybe the railing was lower than they realized, or not as secure as it should have been. Maybe one of them climbed up on something to get a better view and fell. Maybe it was a combination of small factors: slightly slippery deck, a moment of carelessness, a railing that was just a few inches too low. When one of them went over, the other immediately jumped in to try to save them. This is consistent with everything we know about Charles and Evelyn. They were deeply in love. Neither would have stood by and watched their spouse drown without trying to help. Either Charles fell and Evelyn jumped in after him, or Evelyn fell and Charles went in after her. Once they were in the water at night, their chances of survival were essentially zero. The ship would have been moving at cruising speed, probably around 20 knots, which is roughly 23 miles per hour. Within seconds, the ship would have been hundreds of feet away from them. Within a minute, it would have been nearly half a mile away. And the ship didn't know they were gone, so it kept sailing, carrying on with its scheduled route to Grand Cayman. Charles and Evelyn would have been alone in the dark ocean, treading water, calling for help that would never come, watching the lights of the ship disappear over the horizon. Even if they were strong swimmers, even if they managed to stay afloat for hours, they were in the middle of the Caribbean Sea with no land anywhere near them. Hypothermia would set in eventually, even in warm water. Exhaustion would overwhelm them. They would slip beneath the surface and drown. Their bodies would have sunk quickly in the deep Caribbean waters. Days later, when decomposition gases caused them to surface briefly, they would have been miles and miles away from where they went in, carried by currents. Marine life would have quickly consumed soft tissue. Within weeks, there would have been nothing recognizable left to find. The ocean had claimed them completely. This scenario, tragic as it is, explains most of the evidence. It explains why both disappeared simultaneously. It explains why there was no sign of struggle in their cabin. It explains why Evelyn's bracelet was left behind. She might have removed it before bed or before going up on deck because the clasp was bothering her. It explains why nothing was missing from their cabin and why their belongings looked undisturbed. It was simply an accident, a terrible accident that happened in a blind spot where no cameras could see and no witnesses were present. But this is just the most statistically likely explanation. It's not proven. It's not certain. And that's what makes this case so haunting and so frustrating. We will probably never know with absolute certainty what happened during those missing hours between 10:47 on August 15th and 9:30 on August 16th. What we do know is that two young people who had their entire lives ahead of them, who had just promised to love each other forever, who were celebrating the happiest moment of their lives, simply ceased to exist. Somewhere in the dark waters of the Caribbean Sea, their story ended, and the rest of us are left with questions that may never be answered. The Morrison case changed things, though. It changed how we think about cruise ship safety. It changed regulations and requirements. It led to better camera systems, better detection systems, better emergency protocols. Those improvements have probably saved lives over the past 30 years, preventing other families from experiencing the same nightmare that the Morrisons and Gardners have lived through. But for Margaret Morrison, now in her 70s and still living in Knoxville, those improvements are cold comfort. She still has dreams sometimes where her little brother Charles calls her on the phone, apologizing for being out of touch for so long, explaining that there was some incredible misunderstanding, that he and Evelyn are fine and they're coming home. Then she wakes up and remembers that Charles has been gone for over 30 years, that he missed his own parents' funerals, that he never got to be a father like he had planned, that his life was stolen from him when he was just 31 years old. The third-grade classroom at Sequoia Elementary, where Evelyn Morrison used to teach, has had many teachers since 1995. None of her former students who are now adults in their 30s and 40s have forgotten her. They remember her warmth, her kindness, her guitar playing, her genuine interest in their young lives. Some of them became teachers themselves because of her influence. One of her former students created a scholarship fund in her name that helps send underprivileged children to summer camp. It's a small way of keeping her memory alive and honoring the impact she had during her short time on Earth. The vintage postcard collection that Evelyn had been building for years remained in boxes at her parents' house for decades. After they both passed away, the postcards were donated to the Knox County Public Library's local history collection, where they remain today. Anyone can look through them and see glimpses of Evelyn's life. Postcards from Gatlinburg, Asheville, Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans. On the back of each one, in her neat handwriting, are little messages to her future self about what she saw and how she felt. The last postcard in the collection is from Cozumel, Mexico, dated August 14, 1995. It reads, "Swam with a sea turtle today. Charles was so patient teaching me to snorkel. This has been the best week of my life. I can't wait to see what adventures we'll have together. Love always, me. That postcard arrived at her parents' house in late August of 1995, about a week after Evelyn had disappeared. Her mother Susan collapsed when she saw it. This message from her daughter written just hours before she vanished, full of joy and hope and excitement about a future that would never happen. Susan kept that postcard in her wallet for the rest of her life, taking it out sometimes when she needed to feel close to her daughter. The case has been featured in countless true crime books, podcasts, and documentaries over the years. Each new generation discovers the story and becomes fascinated by the mystery. Online forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries have thousands of posts debating what happened. Amateur detectives have created elaborate timelines and theories. Some people have become obsessed with the case, convinced they can solve it if they just look at the evidence from the right angle. But despite all the attention, all the analysis, all the investigation, the fundamental mystery remains. Two people boarded a ship, and they never got off. Everything else is speculation. In 2022, a journalist from the Miami Herald tried to track down everyone who had been on the MS Caribbean Dream during that August 1995 voyage. He managed to locate and interview about 60 former passengers, roughly 5% of those who had been on board. Their memories after 27 years were understandably hazy and unreliable. Most barely remembered the incident at all. A few remembered hearing announcements about missing passengers and seeing FBI agents boarding the ship when they returned to Fort Lauderdale. One woman remembered seeing Evelyn at breakfast on one of the first days and thinking she had a beautiful smile. One man remembered seeing Charles at the ship's gym, but none of them had any information that could solve the mystery. What the journalist found most striking was how many of those former passengers said the Morrison disappearance had affected them for years afterward. Several admitted they had never taken another cruise because of what happened. One woman said she had nightmares for months after the cruise about falling overboard and watching the ship sail away without her. A man said the incident made him paranoid about cruise ship safety and that he now refused to let his children go on cruises, even as adults. The cruise industry has worked hard to suppress and minimize stories like the Morrison case. They argue, with some justification, that cruises are statistically very safe, that millions of people cruise every year without incident, that the number of disappearances and crimes is tiny compared to the overall number of passengers. They point out that you're more likely to be injured or killed in a car accident on the way to the port than you are to disappear from a cruise ship. All of that is true. Cruises are generally safe, but that's cold comfort to the families of people who do disappear. For them, the statistics don't matter. What matters is that their loved one got on a ship and never came back, and nobody can tell them why. The Morrison case also highlighted serious problems with maritime law and jurisdiction. Because cruise ships operate in international waters, it's often unclear which country's laws apply when a crime occurs. The ship might be registered in one country, owned by a company based in another country, staffed by people from dozens of different countries, carrying passengers from yet other countries, and sailing through the territorial waters of multiple nations. This jurisdictional confusion makes investigating crimes at sea incredibly difficult. Evidence can be contaminated or destroyed. Witnesses scatter to different countries when the ship docks. Security footage, if it exists at all, might be erased or recorded over. Crew members might be transferred to other ships or fired before they can be properly interviewed. And cruise companies, which have enormous legal resources, can and do fight aggressively to protect their reputations and limit their liability. Congress has held multiple hearings over the years about improving the investigation of crimes at sea. Some reforms have been passed, including the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act of 2010, which requires cruise lines to maintain rape kits, to report crimes to the FBI, to provide better training for security personnel, and to install other safety measures. But advocates argue that enforcement of these rules is weak and that cruise lines have found ways around many of the requirements. If Charles and Evelyn Morrison had disappeared from a cruise ship today in 2026 instead of in 1995, would the outcome be different? Almost certainly. Modern cruise ships have camera coverage on virtually every deck. Man-overboard detection systems would likely have triggered an immediate alarm if someone went into the water. GPS tracking and modern search and rescue coordination would have enabled a much faster and more effective response. There would be more evidence, more witnesses, more technology to help investigators piece together what happened. But even with all those improvements, people still occasionally disappear from cruise ships. According to data compiled by the International Cruise Victims Organization, an average of 20 to 25 people per year go missing from cruise ships worldwide. Some of those are suicides that are witnessed and confirmed. Some are obvious accidents. Some are crimes that get solved. But a significant number remain mysteries, people who simply vanish without explanation, leaving behind grieving families who will never have closure. The psychological impact of this kind of ambiguous loss is well documented. It's in many ways worse than a confirmed death because there's no body, no funeral, no definitive end. Families are stuck in a permanent state of limbo, unable to fully grieve because some small part of them always wonders if maybe, somehow, their loved one is still alive somewhere. They see someone who looks similar in a crowd, and their heart leaps. They hear a news story about someone with amnesia and wonder if it could be their missing family member. They can never fully let go and move on because they don't have the closure that comes with certainty. Margaret Morrison has talked in interviews about how this ambiguity has affected her life. She's now 75 years old. She never married, never had children. She devoted much of her life to searching for answers about what happened to her brother and to advocating for cruise ship safety reforms. She says that in her heart, she knows Charles and Evelyn are dead, that they've been dead for over 30 years. But her head keeps asking, what if? What if they somehow survived and lost their memories? What if they were kidnapped and have been held captive somewhere all these years? What if they faked their deaths for some reason she can't imagine, and they're living new lives under different names? Logically, she knows these scenarios are impossible. But grief isn't logical. Loss isn't rational. And when you don't have a body, when you don't know for certain what happened, your mind fills in the blanks with every possibility, no matter how unlikely. Some family members of cruise ship disappearance victims have found comfort in connecting with each other, sharing their experiences, supporting each other through the unique pain of this type of loss. Margaret Morrison helped found International Cruise Victims, an organization that supports families affected by crimes and disappearances on cruise ships. The organization advocates for better safety regulations, provides resources to families navigating the complex legal and jurisdictional issues, and works to keep pressure on cruise lines and governments to take passenger safety seriously. Through this advocacy work, Margaret has met dozens of other families who have lost loved ones in circumstances similar to her brother's disappearance. She's met parents whose children vanished from spring break cruises. She's met spouses whose partners disappeared during anniversary trips. She's met siblings, friends, and extended family members, all united by the same terrible experience of loving someone who got on a cruise ship and never got off. What Margaret has learned through these connections is that the Morrison case, while particularly well known because of the honeymoon angle and the media coverage it received, is far from unique. There are dozens of similar cases, many of them receiving little to no media attention. Young people, old people, men, women, people of all backgrounds, all vanishing from ships under mysterious circumstances. Some cases have obvious explanations. Others remain complete mysteries decades later. She's also learned that cruise lines have teams of lawyers whose job is essentially to make these cases go away as quietly as possible. They settle with families for undisclosed amounts in exchange for non-disclosure agreements. They pressure foreign governments not to investigate too thoroughly. They move crew members who might be witnesses to other ships or fire them entirely. They control the narrative, emphasizing safety statistics while downplaying individual tragedies. Margaret believes, and many others agree with her, that the cruise industry's true safety record is much worse than they publicly admit. She thinks that disappearances are significantly underreported, that crimes are covered up, that the industry has become very skilled at managing these incidents in ways that minimize bad publicity and legal liability. The cruise lines, of course, dispute these allegations. They insist they take passenger safety extremely seriously, that they cooperate fully with law enforcement, that they've implemented numerous improvements over the years. They point to their safety records and argue that given the millions of passengers who cruise safely every year, the number of incidents is statistically insignificant. Who's telling the truth? Probably both sides are, to some degree. Cruises are generally safe for the vast majority of passengers. The industry has made genuine improvements in safety and security. But it's also true that the industry's financial incentives are aligned with minimizing negative publicity and controlling the narrative around incidents like disappearances. It's true that the jurisdictional complexities make it easy for investigations to be inadequate. It's true that families often feel stonewalled and dismissed when they try to get answers. The Morrison case sits at the intersection of all these larger issues. It's simultaneously a personal tragedy for two families, an unsolved mystery that captures public imagination, and a case study in the systemic problems with cruise ship safety and maritime law enforcement. On August 15th every year, Margaret Morrison visits the cemetery where her parents are buried. She brings flowers and sits by their graves and talks to them about Charles. She tells them she's still trying to find out what happened to him. She tells them she hasn't given up. She tells them she wishes she had chosen a different wedding gift, something simple and safe. Gift cards or kitchenware or anything that wouldn't have put her brother on that ship. She knows, rationally, that it wasn't her fault. Charles and Evelyn were adults who made their own decision to go on the cruise. Whatever happened to them was not something she could have predicted or prevented. But survivors of tragedies often carry guilt anyway, rational or not. She gave them the gift that put them on that ship. If she had given them something else, anything else, they would still be alive. That thought haunts her. Every August, there's also a small memorial service held at Sequoia Elementary School in Knoxville, where Evelyn used to teach. Current teachers, some of Evelyn's former students who still live in the area, and members of the community gather to remember her. They share stories. They sing some of the folk songs she used to teach. They talk about her impact on the children she taught during her brief career. A small plaque in the school library is dedicated to her memory, and the scholarship fund created in her name has now helped send over 200 children to summer camp. Charles is remembered too, though perhaps less publicly. The Knoxville Department of Public Works has a small memorial in their office conference room honoring employees who have died. Charles Morrison's name is there, along with his dates of service and a brief note that he died in 1995. His former colleagues who are still working have mostly retired now, but those who knew him remember a quiet, competent engineer who did good work and was excited about starting his married life. The ripple effects of Charles and Evelyn's disappearance extend far beyond their immediate families. The other passengers on that cruise were traumatized by the incident. Crew members were affected. The investigators who worked the case and couldn't solve it carry it with them. The journalists who have covered the story over the years think about it. The true crime enthusiasts who study it wonder about it. And somewhere out there, if this was indeed a crime rather than an accident, someone knows what really happened. Someone is carrying that secret, living with that knowledge, perhaps feeling guilt, or perhaps feeling nothing at all. If someone did harm Charles and Evelyn Morrison, they have gotten away with it for more than 30 years. They've lived their life, perhaps raised a family, grown old, all while the Morrison and Gardner families have suffered without answers. That's a difficult thing to accept. The possibility that someone committed a terrible crime and faced no consequences, that justice was never served, that the truth remains hidden. But it's also possible that no crime was committed at all. It's possible this was simply a tragic accident. Two people in the wrong place at the wrong time. A moment of carelessness or bad luck that cost them their lives. If that's the case, then there's no one to blame. No one to hold accountable. Just the cruel randomness of fate. Before we end, I want you to do something. Take a moment and think about this case. Really think about it. Two people who loved each other, who had just promised to spend their lives together, who were excited about their future, gone in an instant. No goodbyes, no explanation, just gone. Now hit that like button if you believe this case deserves to be remembered, if you believe Charles and Evelyn Morrison's story should be told, if you think families dealing with these kinds of tragedies deserve better answers than they're getting. Drop a comment telling me what you think happened. Do you believe it was an accident, a crime, or something else entirely? And subscribe to Cold Case Crimson because we're going to keep covering cases like this. Stories that matter, mysteries that deserve attention, missing people who deserve to be remembered. Ring that notification bell so you never miss an episode. The Morrison case will likely never be officially solved. Too much time has passed. Too much evidence was never collected in the first place. Too many witnesses have died or disappeared into their own lives. The ocean keeps its secrets, and this is one secret it seems determined to keep forever. But even though we may never know exactly what happened to Charles and Evelyn Morrison on the night of August 15th, 1995, we can remember them. We can tell their story. We can learn from the mistakes that were made in the investigation. We can push for better safety measures so that future tragedies might be prevented. We can support the families of missing persons who are living with this unique kind of pain. We can refuse to let their story be forgotten. Charles Morrison would be 61 years old today if he had lived. He and Evelyn might have had children, maybe grandchildren by now. He probably would have retired from the Public Works Department after a long career. He might have taken up hobbies like woodworking or golf. He and Evelyn would have celebrated their 31st wedding anniversary this year. Evelyn Morrison would also be 61. She might have spent decades teaching, influencing hundreds or thousands of students, maybe eventually becoming a principal or curriculum specialist. She would have continued collecting postcards from all the places she visited. She would have filled dozens of journals with her thoughts and sketches and lists of happy things. She and Charles would have grown old together, exactly as they promised each other they would during their wedding vows. Instead, their lives were cut short at 31. 3 decades of experiences, of joys and sorrows, of accomplishments and struggles, of ordinary days and special moments, all stolen from them. Their families were robbed of their presence. The students Evelyn would have taught never got to know her. The children they would have had were never born. The friends they would have made never met them. All the potential of 2 lives, extinguished in a single night for reasons we may never understand. That's the real tragedy of the Morrison case. Not just the mystery of what happened, though that's certainly frustrating and haunting. The real tragedy is the sheer loss of human potential, the waste of 2 good lives that could have brought so much more joy and love and positive impact to the world if they had been allowed to continue. Every unsolved case represents a failure of some kind, a failure of investigation, a failure of technology, a failure of justice, a failure of society. The Morrison case represents all of those failures. The ship's security was inadequate. The investigation, despite everyone's best efforts, couldn't overcome the fundamental lack of evidence. The jurisdictional complications prevented a thorough legal process, and society as a whole has been slow to demand the kind of reforms that might prevent similar tragedies. But this case also represents something else: the enduring power of love and memory. Charles and Evelyn have been gone for over 3 decades, but they are not forgotten. Their families remember them. Their story is told and retold. People all over the world who never met them know their names and care about what happened to them. In that sense, they live on. Margaret Morrison said something in an interview a few years ago that has always stuck with those who heard it. She said, "I used to pray that I would find out what happened to Charles and Evelyn. I used to think that knowing the truth would give me peace. But now I realize that the truth probably won't give me peace. The truth is probably terrible, whether it was an accident or something worse. So now I just pray that wherever they are, they're together. I hope that when they went into that dark water, they were holding hands. I hope they weren't scared. I hope it was quick. I hope they knew they were loved. That's the best outcome I can hope for now." It's a heartbreaking statement, but it also reveals a kind of hard-won wisdom about grief and loss and acceptance. Sometimes there are no good answers. Sometimes you have to make peace with uncertainty. Sometimes you have to find meaning and comfort in whatever small hopes you can cling to. The MS Caribbean dream is gone now, cut up and recycled, its metal repurposed for other ships or other uses. The crew members from that voyage have scattered to the winds, many of them probably no longer working in the cruise industry. Some of them undoubtedly deceased by now, given that it's been over 30 years. The passengers have gone on with their lives, most of them probably rarely thinking about the missing honeymoon couple unless something reminds them of it. But Charles and Evelyn Morrison remain missing. Their case file sits in an FBI office in Miami, gathering dust, waiting for some new lead that may never come. Their families continue to live with the pain of not knowing. And somewhere in the Caribbean Sea, the waters that claimed them continue their endless rhythmic motion, keeping their secrets, offering no answers. This is Cold Case Crimson, and this is the story of Charles and Evelyn Morrison, 2 people who deserve to be remembered, 2 people whose disappearance should never be forgotten, 2 people whose story reminds us that life is fragile, that safety measures matter, that every missing person has a family desperately searching for answers. We may never solve this mystery. We may never know what happened during those missing hours on August 15th, 1995. But we can make sure that Charles and Evelyn Morrison are not just statistics, not just another cold case file, not just a sad story that people vaguely remember hearing about once. They were real people with hopes and dreams and people who loved them. They deserve to be remembered as such. Thank you for watching this investigation into one of the most haunting maritime mysteries in American history. If this story has affected you the way it has affected me, if you believe these cases deserve attention and families deserve answers, then please share this video. Get the word out. Keep the conversation going. And most importantly, subscribe to Cold Case Crimson so we can continue investigating cases like this together, searching for truth, demanding justice, and making sure that missing people are never forgotten. The Morrison family is still hoping for answers after more than 30 years. Maybe someone watching this knows something. Maybe this video will reach the right person. Maybe somehow this case can still be solved. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and never stop asking questions. This is Cold Case Crimson, and the search for truth never ends.